close your eyes and step into another world. A world of shadowed parlors, velvet drapes heavy with dust, and chandeliers whose crystal teardrops flicker in the haze of candle smoke. It is the mid-19th century, in the height of Queen Victoria's reign. The air carries the faint mingling of rosewater perfume, coal smoke drifting in from the city beyond, and the quiet hush of servants padding across the thick carpets. You are a woman of noble birth. At first glance, your life appears gilded, corseted gowns of silk and lace, lit with candlelight, and your name spoken in the glittering halls of London's high society. To the world, you embody refinement and privilege. Yet beneath a polished veneer of pearls and propriety lies a labyrinth of suffocating rules, hidden dangers, and whispers that could unravel your entire existence with a single scandal. This is the dark side of being a noblewoman in Victorian England. But before we sink deeper into the corridors of privilege and peril, tell me, where are you listening from right now? I'd love to know which corner of the world you've joined from. Leave a comment and let me know, because it always fascinates me how history unites us across time and place. And if you enjoy drifting into these immersive stories of forgotten times, tales woven with whispers, shadows, and truth, then consider subscribing to Whispers of History. It helps this community grow and ensures that more wandering souls find these bedtime journeys. To the eyes of outsiders, the life of an aristocratic woman in Victorian England shimmered with enchantment. Gowns rustled like waves of colour, fans fluttered like butterflies at lavish balls, and carriages rolled across cobblestone streets to the sound of horse hooves echoing in the fog. You would have been surrounded by opulence, mahogany furniture gleaming under lamplight, parlours scented with fresh flowers arranged by unseen hands, and endless sets of fine china from which to sip your tea. Visitors would bow respectfully, tipping their hats, and gossip would swirl around you about your dowry, your family's estate, and the potential suitors your mother whispered about in anxious tones. But beneath this surface beauty lay a web of control. Every gesture, every word, even the way you held your fan was dictated by invisible rules of propriety, virtue, and silence. To step outside them was to risk not only your reputation, but your very survival within the aristocratic cage. From the moment you awoke, likely in a room with high ceilings, heavy drapes, and the quiet presence of a lady S-maid bustling with your garments, your life was shaped not by freedom, but by performance. How you dressed, whom you spoke to, when you smiled. These were not choices, but obligations. A noblewoman existed to embody the ideal of Victorian femininity, pious, modest, delicate, yet charming enough to reflect her husband's or father's wealth. Your mornings would begin with a ritual that felt both luxurious and imprisoning. A maid laced your corset tight until your ribs compressed, shaping your body into the desired silhouette of fragility. Another arranged your hair into intricate curls pinned high upon your head. By the time you stepped into daylight, your very body had been molded into an image that wasn't yours, but theirs. Perhaps the most suffocating expectation of all was marriage. To your family, you were not primarily a daughter, but a bargaining chip, a vessel of alliance, fortune, and reputation. Your dowry was discussed long before your heart was ever considered. Love, that was a dangerous luxury. Victorian high society was a theatre, and you were a player on its stage. At balls, and your task was to catch the eye of a suitable man. Suitable meaning wealthy, titled, and acceptable in your family's eyes. You were taught how to dance, how to flutter your fan just so, how to lower your eyes in modesty without appearing dull. But imagine the suffocating pressure of these gatherings. Every smile was calculated, every step scrutinized. If you danced too much with one gentleman, tongues wagged. If you failed to secure attention, your family fretted. And if you dared to fall in love with someone unworthy, perhaps a man of lesser fortune or, heaven forbid, scandalous reputation, you risked ruin. But the darkness did not stop at expectations of marriage. Even after the vows were spoken and the carriage carried you to a grand estate, the chains grew tighter. A noblewoman's duties were endless: to bear heirs, to host elegant dinners, to manage the household staff, and to embody a standard of virtue so high it was almost inhuman. Yet you had no legal power of your own. Victorian law placed women firmly under the authority of their husbands. Your wealth, your dowry, even your inheritance belonged to him once you married. Your role was ornamental: a jewel on his arm, a whisper of refinement for his reputation. And should you fail, if you could not bear children, if you strayed outside the narrow confines of duty, the whispers would grow into storms. Rumors in drawing rooms could destroy you faster than any sword. For noblewomen, scandal was a kind of death, and many did not survive it intact. Yet, behind the polished doors and lace curtains, secrets thrived. Affairs whispered about, but never spoken aloud. Illnesses hidden beneath powder and rouge, and women who longed for more than their gilded cages allowed. Some read forbidden novels, some confided in one another, and some dared to step into shadows society forbade. But secrets were dangerous things. One wrong word, one stray glance, and you could become the subject of gossip that spread through London faster than wildfire. Servants carried whispers between households, rivals exploited rumors, and the newspapers, those hungry beasts of the Victorian age, could devour reputations in a single printed column. Tonight, we are going to peel back the velvet curtains and explore these hidden chambers of Victorian nobility. We will walk through the ballrooms, the drawing rooms, and the locked bedchambers where truth was often stranger than fiction. We will meet noblewomen whose lives glittered with diamonds, but whose hearts ached with loneliness. We will uncover the tragedies hidden behind polished portraits, and we will see how the dark side of privilege shaped an entire generation of women who were both adored and trapped. So settle into the cushions, let your eyes grow heavy, and allow history to whisper its secrets. The night is only beginning, and we have much to uncover about the perilous beauty of being a noblewoman in Victorian England. Dawn in a Victorian household did not begin with birdsong, but with the muted clatter of servants preparing fires, carrying water, and setting trays for the family upstairs. If you were a noblewoman, you did not wake to silence. Instead, the day began with the quiet rustle of your maid entering the room, pulling back heavy drapes that let in the pale English light and setting about the business of dressing you for a life that was not your own. The routine was elaborate, almost theatrical. First, you were offered a small breakfast, perhaps tea with a biscuit, while the maid readied your garments. Then came the ordeal of the corset, ribs pressed, lungs constrained, your body forced into the silhouette that society demanded. The hourglass shape was not simply a matter of fashion. It was a visible symbol of discipline, control, and compliance. Every gasp, every faint spell, was a reminder that your very body was a battlefield between expectation and survival. Once your corset was laced, layers upon layers of fabric followed. Petticoats, skirts, bodices trimmed with lace, gloves that covered your hands so that your skin was protected from the sun's kiss. Pale skin was the mark of privilege, proof you did not toil in fields or factories. And so you moved through the day cloaked in garments that were less about comfort than about performance. Your mornings were often spent in rituals of etiquette. If you were married, letters from acquaintances and invitations to social events would be brought to you on a silver tray. If unmarried, your mother or chaperone hovered over correspondence, ensuring every reply preserved your reputation. Writing a letter in your own hand was an art form, a delicate balance of wit and restraint. One wrong phrase, one unintended flourish, and a harmless note could be twisted into scandalous suggestion. Afternoons could be a procession of calls and visits. In Victorian society, the exchange of calling cards was a ritual of immense importance. To call upon another lady of rank was to place yourself within the delicate dance of alliances and rivalries. If you received too few cards, whispers might question your popularity. If you called upon the wrong household, tongues could wag about your taste and loyalty. Every visit was a silent negotiation of status, and you were always aware of eyes watching, judging, measuring your worth. At home, the household itself was an empire, but not yours to rule. The vast estates of noble families required dozens of servants, butlers, maids, footmen, cooks, grooms. Though it was your duty to manage them, true authority was slippery. Every order you gave was carried out by people who often knew more of your secrets than you dared to imagine. Servants saw everything. They knew who came and went, what conversations unfolded, even what tears were shed behind closed doors. And while loyalty was valued, gossip was currency. The cook's assistant might share a whispered remark in the marketplace, and suddenly your private life became fodder for half the city. The rules of conduct within your own household were suffocating. You could not walk untrepanned in public without sparking suspicion. You could not raise your voice, laugh too loudly, or linger too long with any man who was not your husband. You were expected to embody grace and restraint at all times, no matter what grief or desire stirred within you. Even the way you poured tea was scrutinized. Did you hold the cup with the correct poise? Did you offer it first to the guest of highest rank? Every gesture reinforced the hierarchy, and any slip could become the seed of damaging gossip. The shadow of the drawing room loomed large in your daily life. These gatherings of women, seemingly innocent with embroidery, tea, and piano music, were in fact arenas of power. Conversations flowed politely on the surface, but beneath, rivalries churned. A misplaced comment, a careless remark, could brand you foolish or cruel. Stories were traded like currency, and women of noble standing were both the traders and the traded. For many, it was a suffocating performance, one where the wrong word might destroy a lifetime of careful reputation. And then there was the weight of propriety in matters of love and marriage. As a young noblewoman, your friendships with men were scrutinized to an absurd degree. A walk in the garden, a shared glance at the opera, even a conversation held too long. These could be twisted into tales of impropriety. You were never alone. A chaperone was always present, a reminder that your body, your heart, and your choices were not yours to guard. They belonged to your family's honor, to your future husband's name, to society itself. Inside the home, dangers were quieter, but no less oppressive. The constant wearing of tight corsets led to fainting, damaged ribs, and, in some cases, long-term health consequences. Childbirth loomed like a specter, a duty expected of every wife, yet a trial that claimed countless women's lives. Physicians of the time often dismissed women's suffering as hysteria, prescribing rest cures that only deepened their isolation. To be ill was not simply to suffer. It was to risk being seen as weak, unfit, or troublesome. For all the wealth and comfort surrounding you, you were in many ways imprisoned by invisibility. You could not vote. You could not own property once married. Your opinions, if spoken too boldly, could be dismissed with a patronizing smile. Your role was to smile graciously, to sit in silence at the table while men debated politics and business, and to retreat politely when your presence was no longer required. And yet, within this suffocating world, noblewomen found ways to carve out slivers of identity. Some devoted themselves to charitable causes, hospitals, schools, relief for the poor, gaining a measure of respect without crossing the boundaries of propriety. Others expressed themselves through art, music, or writing, often under pseudonyms. Still others wielded influence through subtle persuasion, guiding husbands and sons in decisions that shaped politics from behind the curtain. But every act of quiet rebellion was a risk. To be too outspoken, too visible, too bold, was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny was a weapon. It could strip away your dignity, tarnish your name, and leave you socially exiled. A fate worse than death for many noble families. As night fell, the performances of the day ended, but the expectations did not. Dinner was another stage, filled with rituals and endless unspoken rules. The seating arrangement itself reflected status, every course served with precision. Conversation was measured, laughter carefully restrained. And when at last you withdrew for the evening, you carried the weight of another day lived not for yourself, but for the demands of society. Tomorrow would bring the same rituals, the same corsets, the same smiles, and the same whispered dangers. In Victorian England, the dark side of nobility was not always the grand scandal that filled newspapers. Often, it was the quiet suffocation of countless small sacrifices, invisible to the world yet deeply felt by every woman who lived behind the lace curtains of privilege. Stories of real noblewomen in Victorian England reveal the shadows hidden behind portraits that still hang in grand houses today. Their lives were wrapped in silks and jewels, yet many found themselves entangled in webs of sorrow, duty, and scandal. To outsiders, they were paragons of elegance. Within their private worlds, they were often prisoners. Consider Lady Caroline Norton. Born into privilege, she should have lived a life of ease, but her marriage to George Norton revealed the cruel truth of Victorian law. When the relationship soured, Caroline attempted to leave her abusive husband. Yet because the law granted husbands absolute control, George kept her children from her, seized her earnings, and dragged her reputation through endless legal battles. For years, Caroline fought not just for herself, but for all women trapped in similar chains. And though she endured heartbreak, her struggle eventually influenced the reform of custody laws. Hers was a story of darkness turned into reluctant change, but the personal cost was immense. Then there was Lady Flora Hastings, lady-in-waiting to Queen Victoria. In 1839, whispers began to circulate that Flora was hiding a pregnancy. The result, people claimed, of a secret affair. The court's gossip became vicious. Queen Victoria herself, still young and impressionable, believed the rumors. But Lady Flora was not pregnant. She was gravely ill. The swelling of her abdomen was caused by a tumor, not by scandal. She died later that year, her reputation blackened by falsehoods she could not escape. For noblewomen, the mere hint of impropriety could destroy not only their social standing, but their peace in death. The list continues. Lady Emily Bulwer-Lytton, daughter of the famed novelist Edward Bulwer-Lytton, was confined by her husband when her erratic behavior was deemed shameful. The Victorian cure for women who strayed too far from the mold was often incarceration, whether in their homes, in private asylums, or in so-called rest cures that silenced their voices. Many bright and restless women, whose ideas might have shaped the world, were instead hidden behind locked doors. These were not isolated tragedies. They reflected a broader truth. Noble women were expected to be both perfect and invisible. A wife who challenged her husband, a daughter who disobeyed her family, or a widow who refused to fade into the background risked more than gossip. She risked being branded mad, immoral, or unworthy. Within this fragile web of expectation, love itself became perilous. Many young noblewomen dreamed of romance, of marrying for affection rather than duty. But love rarely aligned with family ambition. Marriages were transactions carefully arranged to consolidate wealth and power. A heart that strayed outside those lines invited ruin. One infamous case was that of Lady Harriet Mordaunt. Married to Sir Charles Mordaunt, she was accused of infidelity in 1869, a scandal that shook the aristocracy. When confronted, she confessed to multiple affairs, even claiming that the Prince of Wales himself was among her lovers. The fallout was catastrophic. Declared insane and confined to an asylum, Lady Mordaunt spent the rest of her life hidden away, her reputation shattered. The men accused of involvement escaped relatively unscathed, their status shielding them. She alone bore the punishment, her voice silenced forever. Stories like hers reveal the double standard that noblewomen lived under. Men might engage in affairs and emerge with little more than whispers trailing behind them. But for women, even a rumor was enough to destroy everything. A noblewoman's worth was tethered to chastity, obedience, and discretion. To break free was to risk obliteration. Beyond the personal tragedies were the unspoken dangers of childbirth and medicine. Every noble family needed heirs, and women bore the responsibility. Yet childbirth in Victorian England was perilous. Even the finest doctors were often ignorant of infection and hygiene. Noblewomen suffered through repeated pregnancies, miscarriages, and deaths in childbed. Queen Victoria herself endured 9 deliveries, describing them as torture. For women without the Queen's protections, the dangers were even greater. Some died quietly in their beds, remembered only for the heirs they left behind. Others endured lives of frailty, their bodies broken by repeated confinements. There was also the creeping shadow of female illness, a vague category under which doctors placed everything from depression to exhaustion. Women who resisted their roles or displayed strong emotions were often labeled hysterical. Treatments ranged from isolation in dark rooms to forced feeding and sedation. What today we would recognize as mental illness or the natural struggles of life were pathologized as evidence of female weakness. Once branded, escape was nearly impossible. And yet, within these tragedies, moments of resilience shone. Noblewomen who suffered injustice sometimes found ways to push back. Caroline Norton's legal battles planted seeds of reform. Other women wrote novels, memoirs, and poetry that exposed the cracks in society's perfect facade. Some wielded influence through philanthropy, carving out space where they could act with autonomy. In drawing rooms and behind closed doors, they whispered to one another, finding solidarity in shared burdens. The newspapers of the day thrived on these scandals. Papers like the Times and the Illustrated London News eagerly printed tales of noblewomen's downfall. A court case, a rumor of infidelity, a sudden illness, all became fodder for public consumption. Readers devoured the stories, delighting in the downfall of those who lived above them. A noblewoman's humiliation became entertainment for the masses, and there was no defense against the printed word once ink met paper. Imagine, then, the quiet terror of living each day under invisible surveillance. Every choice weighed, every friendship observed, every faint smile interpreted. To walk through life in that gilded world was to balance on a knife's edge. A step too far, and you could plunge into disgrace. Behind portraits that still hang in ancestral homes, the painted smiles of noblewomen conceal lives of profound struggle. The heavy gowns they wore were as much armor as prison. The jewels at their throats were not freedom, but chains. And though their names often survive in history books, the truth of their pain, their longing, and their suffocation is far less often told. The stories of Lady Caroline Norton, Lady Flora Hastings, Lady Harriet Mordaunt, and countless others remind us that the Victorian ideal of womanhood was built upon silence, suffering, and sacrifice. These women were celebrated as ornaments of their families, yet stripped of power to shape their own destinies. And this was the cruel paradox of nobility in Victorian England. To the world, you were privileged, pampered, untouchable. But in truth, you lived one mistake away from ruin, one whisper away from destruction, one breath away from invisibility. The punishments awaiting a noble woman who strayed from society's expectations were not always delivered in the form of chains or prison cells. More often, they came wrapped in whispers, delivered in drawing rooms, whispered across dinner tables, and printed in the cruel ink of newspapers. A fall from grace was a spectacle, and the higher your status, the farther you had to tumble. For some, the punishment was social exile. A woman accused of scandal might find her invitations suddenly withdrawn. The glittering balls, the elegant dinners, the opera boxes, all closed their doors. Former friends avoided her gaze in public. Mothers warned their daughters not to be seen in her company, and within weeks she could become invisible. For a noblewoman whose entire life depended upon appearances, this was not mere inconvenience, it was annihilation. The cruelty of exile lay in its silence. There were no official proclamations, no trials, simply a steady withdrawal of acknowledgement until she was left alone. A woman who once hosted could find herself confined to her estate. reduced to pacing the halls of her gilded cage, her only companions the same servants who carried whispers that helped undo her. For others, the punishment was confinement. Husbands wielded extraordinary power over their wives. If a woman displeased him through defiance, suspected infidelity, or even eccentricity, he could have her declared insane and committed to an asylum. Once there, her voice vanished into institutional silence. No court, no appeal, no rescue. For many, these confinements lasted decades, their existence reduced to footnotes in family histories. One cruel reality of Victorian society was that silence itself could be punishment. Noblewomen were often forced to swallow grief, anger, or despair, forbidden to voice anything that might suggest discontent. A woman who raised her voice risked being labeled hysterical. A woman who cried too loudly risked ridicule. Emotional expression was dangerous, and so repression became survival. The punishment of silence corroded slowly, leaving countless women to endure inwardly until their health collapsed under the weight. Even within the sacred bonds of marriage, punishments were etched into the law. If a wife strayed, she risked everything: her home, her children, her fortune. A husband's infidelity might be shrugged off, but a wife's indiscretion was treated as betrayal beyond forgiveness. Divorce was technically possible, but the process was a public spectacle. Courtrooms filled with curious onlookers, journalists jotted every detail, and reputations were shredded. For many women, the very idea of escape was worse than the misery of staying. Religion, too, was a force of judgment. Ministers preached about the sanctity of the family, the virtues of womanly obedience, the dangers of vanity and desire. To sit in the pews as whispers circled around you, to hear a sermon that seemed aimed directly at your failures, was its own form of public shaming. Even faith, which might have offered comfort, was twisted into a mechanism of control. The newspapers, however, delivered the sharpest blows. The Victorian press thrived on scandal, and noblewomen made excellent copy. Tales of adultery, madness, and impropriety filled columns, read hungrily by those who envied and despised the upper classes in equal measure. A single rumor printed in black and white could travel faster than truth, destroying reputations overnight. It was spectacle and punishment rolled into one. But not all punishments were delivered by society at large. Some came from within families themselves. A father might disown a daughter who disobeyed. A brother might cut off her allowance. A husband might lock her out of her own home. These punishments were not theatrical, but devastatingly effective. They severed ties, removed protections, and left women vulnerable in a world where survival depended on family name and fortune. The cruel irony was that noblewomen were punished not only for missteps, but also for daring to want more. A woman who sought education, who spoke too boldly of politics, who longed for independence. She was often mocked, belittled, or ostracized. Her ambitions were treated as arrogance, her intellect as unfeminine. In a world where obedience was the highest virtue, ambition itself became a crime. And yet the punishments that loomed largest were the invisible ones, the ones woven into the very fabric of daily life. The corset that crushed your ribs was a punishment disguised as beauty. The endless pregnancies that drained your strength were a punishment disguised as duty. The silence demanded at the dinner table was a punishment disguised as refinement. Every ritual of nobility, every gesture of elegance, carried within it the shadow of control. Imagine sitting in a gilded chair at a banquet table, candles blazing, silverware clinking, while laughter and conversation swirled around you. Outwardly, you were the picture of privilege. Inwardly, you knew that a single misstep, a rumor, a smile held too long, a letter intercepted, could undo you. The punishment hovered constantly, invisible yet inescapable, shaping every breath you took. Sometimes, noblewomen were punished simply for being inconvenient. A barren wife could be discarded, quietly exiled to a country estate, while her husband pursued heirs elsewhere. A widow who showed too much independence might be pressured into remarriage, her fortune redirected to another man's control. Even those who lived without scandal could find themselves punished by isolation, loneliness, and the crushing weight of expectations they never chose. Yet, amid this darkness, whispers of rebellion lingered. Some women turned punishment into quiet defiance. Exiled from society, they wrote novels that revealed its hypocrisies. Confined to estates, they nurtured charitable works that touched thousands of lives. Silenced in conversation, they guided husbands and sons behind the scenes, shaping decisions in ways history often forgets. Their punishment did not always erase them. Sometimes it hardened them into forces of quiet change. Still, the system endured, and countless noblewomen disappeared into its shadows. They are the names we do not know, the faces lost to time. They lived within the glittering palaces and crumbling country houses, navigating a world where punishment was never far away. To be born a noblewoman in Victorian England was to walk constantly under judgment, balancing grace against survival, beauty against danger, silence against the desperate desire to be heard. And as you sink deeper into the cushions and let these images surround you, imagine the constant tension of such a life. A life where every privilege was also a chain, and every indulgence carried its hidden price. For noblewomen, punishment was not an occasional terror. It was a constant shadow, cast across every step, every breath, every whispered word. In the midst of so much restriction and fear, noblewomen in Victorian England were not entirely powerless. Even within the gilded cage, some found cracks in the bars, small spaces where light crept in and where strength could grow. Their acts of resilience were often subtle, hidden beneath layers of propriety, but they were no less real. Charity became one of the most acceptable avenues for noblewomen to exercise influence. To the outside world, philanthropy was an extension of feminine virtue, compassion, piety, selflessness. Yet within that guise, women carved out remarkable authority. They founded hospitals, funded schools, organized relief for the poor, and even lobbied for social reforms. By couching ambition in the language of care, they managed to act decisively in public without appearing unfeminine. For many, this work offered a sense of purpose beyond the walls of drawing rooms and dining tables. Take Angela Burdickhouse, one of the wealthiest women of the era. Though not a duchess or countess, her fortune and connections placed her among the elite. Instead of fading into ornamental silence, she poured her resources into philanthropic causes, supporting everything from education to housing reform. She was admired even by Charles Dickens, who praised her generosity. Her example revealed that noblewomen could use their status for more than appearances. They could wield it as a tool for shaping society itself. Others found power through intellect and art. Writing was one of the few outlets where noblewomen could express themselves, often under pseudonyms. Lady Charlotte Guest translated the Mabinogion, bringing Welsh mythology to wider audiences. Others composed poetry or novels, sometimes slipping subversive ideas between the lines of genteel storytelling. Writing allowed women to speak in ways society would not tolerate in drawing rooms. Through the page, they claimed a voice that could not be easily silenced. Music and art offered similar refuges. A noblewoman who sat at the piano was fulfilling her expected role, yet she could pour her emotions into the notes, creating a space where sorrow and longing transformed into beauty. Those who painted or sketched left behind private glimpses of their inner lives. These creations were not only acts of expression, but quiet defiance against the command to remain ornamental and voiceless. Influence could also be exercised within the family. A woman might not hold legal authority, but she could guide the men around her. Husbands, sons, and brothers often listened, whether they admitted it or not, to the counsel of the women in their households. Some noblewomen became adept at persuasion, shaping political decisions or business dealings through careful suggestion. This was power exercised in whispers, but power nonetheless. Friendship and solidarity offered another form of resilience. Women confined by strict social rules often turned to one another for support. Letters exchanged between noblewomen reveal confessions, encouragement, and shared frustrations. Behind closed doors, away from the scrutiny of society, they confided their struggles and lifted one another's spirits. Though their words were sometimes cautious, they formed bonds that allowed them to endure. And then there were those who defied society more boldly. Some pursued affairs despite the risks, choosing passion over obedience. Others abandoned the stage of high society altogether, retreating to country estates where they could live more freely. These acts often carried heavy consequences, but they were expressions of a longing for autonomy that could not be entirely extinguished. The resilience of noble women was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was as simple as finding joy in small acts of rebellion, reading a novel considered too daring, sneaking moments of solitude in a garden when chaperones were distracted, refusing to smile when expected, or daring to express an opinion in a conversation where silence was demanded. These gestures might seem small, but they were deeply meaningful in a world where every choice was scrutinized. Even illness, so often used as a tool to control women, could become a space of resistance. Some women leaned into the role of invalid to carve out privacy, using the guise of fragility to avoid unwanted obligations. If society demanded they attend endless dinners or endure suffocating company, illness offered an escape. Behind the excuse of poor health, a woman might rest, read, or simply breathe without performance. Resilience also appeared in the legacies women left behind. Though many were silenced in life, their diaries, letters, and memoirs reveal voices that could not be erased. Lady Mary Crawley, Lady Sarah Lennox, and countless others left behind words that allow us to glimpse their thoughts, their wit, and their sorrow. Even if their contemporaries ignored them, history can hear them now. The contradictions of Victorian womanhood created unexpected spaces for strength. A woman expected to be silent could speak volumes through her needlework, stitching symbols and meanings into patterns only other women might notice. A wife forbidden to own property might still control household accounts, subtly directing where money flowed. A mother, officially powerless, might shape the character of a future statesman. These acts of quiet endurance and influence were not celebrated, but they were real. And sometimes, resilience came in the form of transformation. The very punishments designed to silence women instead gave rise to reform. The scandals of Lady Caroline Norton, the confinement of women declared hysterical, the tragedies of childbirth, each horror gradually built momentum for change. Noblewomen themselves, along with allies in Parliament, began pushing for reforms in marriage, property, and custody laws. Progress was slow, and many women paid terrible prices, but their suffering planted seeds that would grow into future freedoms. To imagine resilience in this world is to picture a candle flickering in a vast, dark room. The darkness of expectation, control, and punishment pressed heavily, but still the light endured. Every act of charity, every page of a diary, every whispered word between friends was a spark against the gloom. Noblewomen may have been trapped, but they were never entirely defeated. As you let these images drift through your mind, remember that resilience is not always a matter of loud rebellion or visible triumph. For Victorian noblewomen, resilience often meant survival, enduring the silence, finding joy in the smallest of freedoms, and passing on to the next generation the hope that one day the cage would break. And in their endurance, they left behind more than silence. They left whispers of courage, fragments of strength, and reminders that even in the most constricting of worlds, the human spirit finds ways to breathe. As the years passed and the blossoms of youth faded, noblewomen in Victorian England often found themselves stepping into another role entirely, that of the widow, the dowager, the matriarch cloaked in black crepe and lace. If the early years of womanhood were defined by suffocating expectations of beauty, marriage, and obedience, the later years were shaped by the heavy silence of decline and the strange freedom that came with it. For many, widowhood was both a sentence and a liberation. The death of a husband could bring grief, loneliness, and uncertainty, but it also brought a sliver of autonomy. A widow could control her dowry or inheritance in ways a married woman could not. For the first time in her life, she might possess legal authority over her own fortune. Yet this autonomy came wrapped in mourning clothes and bound by ritual. Victorian mourning customs were elaborate, dictated not only by family but by society at large. A noblewoman was expected to wear deep black for 2 full years after her husband's death. The garments were heavy, stiff, and unadorned, a physical manifestation of grief. Jewelry was permitted only if it was made of jet or contained a lock of the deceased's hair. Social engagements were restricted. For months, sometimes years, the widow lived as a ghost of herself, her life narrowed to shadows. But within this ritualized grief, many women discovered an unexpected truth. The eyes of society no longer watched quite so closely. A widow's silence was expected, but within that silence she could maneuver in ways denied to younger women. Some used their widowhood to manage estates with skill, proving more capable than the husbands who had preceded them. Others became patrons of the arts or leaders in charitable work, using their status to leave lasting legacies. In mourning, they sometimes found their truest voices. Yet not all widows found freedom. For those without strong inheritances, widowhood could mean financial uncertainty. A dowager might be displaced by her son and his new wife, forced into the background of the very estate she had once presided over. In London, widows without means often became dependent on relatives, their dignity eroded by reliance on family charity. The grand black dresses might have concealed poverty as well as grief. Aging itself carried its own punishment. In a society obsessed with youth and beauty, noble women who grew older often found themselves pushed to the margins. The compliments and attentions that once flowed so easily diminished, replaced by dismissive smiles. An unmarried noblewoman past her prime became a spinster, a figure of pity or ridicule. A widow who lingered too long without remarrying was treated as a relic. The world of balls, operas, and belonged to the young. For older women, the drawing room became smaller, the audiences fewer. Still, some embraced this stage of life as an opportunity to withdraw from the theatre of appearances. Freed from the suffocating rituals of courtship and chaperones, older noblewomen could form deeper friendships, pursue intellectual interests, or simply live more quietly. They had already performed their roles, already endured the gossip, the pregnancies, the endless cycles of expectation. What remained was a quieter endurance, touched by both melancholy and peace. Isolation was a common fate, particularly for those whose lives had been shaped entirely by their families. A noblewoman who lost her children to marriage or distance, who saw her friends fade one by one, could find herself wandering lonely corridors in vast houses, her only company the portraits of ancestors staring down from the walls. Servants attended her needs, but their presence underscored the silence rather than eased it. Nights could stretch long, filled with memories of what had been and regrets for what never was. And yet, others transformed isolation into power. The archetype of the formidable dowager emerged. Older noble women who commanded respect through sheer will, guiding families with sharp tongues and sharper minds. These women may have been mocked for their sternness, but they often wielded influence far greater than they had in their youth. By outliving their husbands, they became the keepers of legacy, the guardians of memory, and the quiet architects of their family's future. The shadow of illness loomed larger in these later years. Victorian medicine remained a treacherous field, filled with dubious treatments and little understanding of women's health. Gout, consumption, and female complaints plagued older noblewomen, who often endured endless regimens of tonics, poultices, and rest cures. For many, aging meant surrendering once again to the control of doctors who dismissed their pain as hysteria or weakness. Even in their decline, noblewomen were not permitted to own their suffering. it was interpreted and managed by others. But if illness eroded the body, memory became a sanctuary. Diaries, letters, and memoirs offered older women a chance to preserve their stories. Some wrote candidly about their lives, recording joys, sorrows, and secrets that society had forced them to hide in youth. These words, sometimes published, often hidden in drawers, reveal voices unafraid of judgment. The distance of age loosened the chains of propriety. They had lived the performance long enough. Now they could tell the truth, if only to themselves. The twilight years of noblewomen in Victorian England carried a mixture of sorrow, resilience, and reflection. Some faded into obscurity, their names barely remembered outside genealogical charts. Others left legacies in philanthropy, art, or family lore. A few wielded real power, guiding their descendants with wisdom born of survival, and many more endured quietly, their lives reduced to whispers in candlelit rooms, their struggles erased beneath the polite silence of history. Yet the dark side of nobility did not vanish with age. Even as widows, noblewomen were expected to embody virtue, to serve as examples for younger generations. They could not escape judgment entirely. Their reputations remained fragile, their worth still measured against ideals of modesty, obedience, and restraint. The cage of expectation never fully opened, though its bars sometimes bent. Imagine the older noblewoman seated by the fire in her drawing room, hands clasped over a Bible or embroidery, the echoes of past scandals still haunting her mind. She remembers the fainting spells of youth, the dangers of childbirth, the sharp edge of gossip. She remembers the punishments, the silences, the resilience it took simply to endure. And now, in the final chapters of her life, she contemplates what it all meant, whether privilege had been a gift or simply a more beautiful prison. As her story wins toward its close, so too does the story of a generation. For behind the black lace veils and the stiff mourning crepe, behind the portraits of dowagers and the memoirs left in fading ink, lies the truth of noble womanhood in Victorian England. It was a life of beauty, yes, but also of suffocation. A life gilded with pearls, yet shadowed by silence. A life that demanded sacrifice, endurance, and constant performance, from youth until the very end. The story of noblewomen in Victorian England is not a tale of unbroken privilege or effortless grace. It is, instead, a story of contradictions, of women adored and admired, yet silenced and controlled, from the first lacing of a corset to the final years spent in mourning crepe. Their lives were performed upon a stage where every gesture mattered and every misstep could summon ruin. To walk through the drawing rooms of the 19th century was to breathe air heavy with expectation. A noblewoman existed not for herself but for others, for her family's ambition, for her husband's authority, for society's gaze. And yet, even within these restrictions, she found ways to endure. Sometimes she whispered her truth in a letter, sometimes in a charitable act, sometimes only in the privacy of her own thoughts. These whispers may have seemed faint at the time, but together they form the quiet chorus of resilience that history too often forgets. The legacy of these women is both haunting and instructive. Their suffering and struggles exposed the fragility of a system that valued appearances above humanity. Scandals that destroyed lives forced society to confront the hypocrisy of its double standards. Tragedies in childbirth and confinement highlighted the urgent need for reform. Through their endurance, these women became unwilling architects of change. Their broken lives revealed where the system itself was broken. Consider how the world shifted because of their pain. Caroline Norton's fight reshaped custody laws. The whispers around mistreated wives eventually led to reforms in property rights. The endless tragedies of women silenced under the label of hysteria sparked conversations about medicine and the treatment of the mind. These changes did not come quickly, nor did they erase the injustices of the time, but they laid the groundwork for the freedoms that later generations would inherit. And yet, When we look back at the portraits hanging in stately homes, we see none of this. We see smiles painted carefully, dresses rendered in exquisite detail, pearls glowing against pale skin. The canvases conceal the struggles, erasing the tears, the punishments, the whispered rebellions. To visitors, these portraits suggest perfection. But if you listen closely, perhaps you can hear the echoes behind the silence, the quiet voices of women who longed for more than their painted likenesses reveal. Their legacy is also deeply personal. To imagine yourself in their place is to feel the tension of a life lived under constant observation, to sense the weight of a reputation that could shatter with a single rumor. It is to know that privilege is not the same as freedom, and that beauty and luxury often conceal invisible chains. The dark side of nobility was not the absence of wealth, but the absence of self. And yet, we should not see these women only as victims. They were survivors, navigating impossible circumstances with as much dignity and creativity as they could muster. Their strength lay in endurance, in finding meaning where society denied them voice, in shaping futures they would never live to see. They remind us that even in the most restrictive of worlds, humanity finds ways to persist. As the Victorian era drew to a close, the role of noblewomen began to shift. The suffrage movement gathered momentum, new laws reshaped property and marriage rights, and the rigid codes of society slowly loosened. The world was changing, and though many of these women did not live to see it, their struggles helped carve the path forward. The dark side of their existence became the fertile ground from which brighter futures could grow. Now, as you sit listening to these whispers of the past, imagine the long halls of a Victorian estate at night. The lamps flicker, portraits watch silently, and somewhere in the silence you hear the faint rustle of silk, the faint echo of voices long gone. They are the voices of women who lived, who loved, who endured, who suffered. They remind us that history is not only written in the deeds of kings and lords, but in the hidden lives of those who were told to remain silent. So what do we take from their story? Perhaps it is this: privilege does not guarantee freedom. Appearances can be prisons, and the resilience of those who endure injustice is often the spark that lights the fire of change. The noblewomen of Victorian England were both victims and visionaries, trapped and yet enduring, silenced and yet still speaking across time. As this journey comes to an end, I hope you carry with you not only the image of corseted gowns and glittering, but also the knowledge of the shadows that lay behind them. Theirs was a world of beauty laced with sorrow, elegance haunted by fear, and resilience born in silence. And now, dear listener, let your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts drift softly. The story of the noblewomen has been told, and their voices, once silenced, have reached you across the centuries. Sleep gently tonight, knowing that even in the darkest of cages, the human spirit seeks light. If you've enjoyed this story, consider subscribing to Whispers of History so that you never miss the chance to wander through forgotten worlds with us. Leave a comment, too. Tell me where you are listening from, and share your thoughts about these hidden chapters of the past. Together, we bring history alive, one whisper at a time. Good night.